Barnaby Keech had the good sense to go pale. Cyprian's hand didn't waver. It hung in the space between them, between Elodie and the man who'd mistaken her patience for permission, and it didn't move, because it didn't need to. The whole room had already rearranged itself around him. Chairs scraped back imperceptibly. Conversations died mid-syllable. Even the low jazz bleeding from the speakers seemed to thin. "Take your hand off her," Cyprian said. Quietly. The way a judge reads a sentence. Barnaby released her. Of course he did. Elodie stepped back, tray still level against her chest, muscle memory holding her together when everything else was sliding, and finally let herself look at him fully. Up close, Cyprian Voss was less a man than a decision. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the ghost of ink curling above his collar like a secret his suit was barely keeping. He turned to her then, and something in his expression shifted, not softer, exactly, but specific. "Chosen. You've been on your feet for 9 hours, he said. "Sit down." Not a request. Not quite a command. A claiming. "Hello, my beautiful family. I'm really glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to check in with you. I hope your day has been kind to you. And if it hasn't, I hope this space can give you a little peace, comfort, an escape, or even a chance to slow down for a while. If this is your very first time here, I want to give you a very warm welcome. You're already part of the big family. Take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps our circle grow, and it's the only reason these stories can come to life. Also, say hello in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let go of the day and just be here fully. Take a deep breath, get comfortable, maybe grab a popcorn or something, and let's step into today's story together. She didn't sit. That was the first thing Cyprian noted about her, that even exhausted, even shaken, even with the ghost of another man's grip still reddening her wrist, Elodie Mirth did not fold. She stood her ground in the middle of Harlow's diner with her tray against her chest like a shield and her chin at an angle that cost her something, and she looked at him the way people rarely did. Directly. Without performance. He found it extraordinary. "I don't take breaks," she said. "And I don't take orders from customers." "No." He settled back into the booth, unhurried, and gestured to the seat across from him with 2 fingers. "You take everything else though, don't you? The double shifts. The Barnabys. The weight of a debt that isn't yours." He paused. "Sit down, Elodie." The sound of her name in his mouth made her go very still. She sat. He didn't smile. She would learn, eventually, that Cyprian Voss rarely did, but something in his jaw eased, the faintest concession. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way she imagined architects looked at load-bearing walls. Assessing. Respectful of the pressure they'd been holding. "How do you know my name?" she asked. "The same way I know your mother's name is Vivian. That she was admitted to Callaway Medical 14 months ago. That her treatment costs have compounded to a figure your salary, even doubled, even tripled, cannot reasonably service." He let that land without decoration. "And that 6 weeks ago, the private lending firm holding that debt sold it." The blood left Elodie's face so completely she felt the cold of it. "Sold it to who?" "To my family." The jazz kept playing. Somewhere behind her, a busboy dropped a fork and the sound cracked through the room like a small gunshot. Elodie didn't blink. She was running calculations the way she always did when panic threatened, numbers, variables, exit strategies, but every column she opened led to the same answer, and the answer was him, and she didn't know yet what that meant except that it was enormous. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you own my mother's debt." "I'm telling you the Voss family does, yes." "And you came here tonight to, what? Collect?" The word came out harder than she intended, ground down to its ugliest edge. She's in a hospital bed. She has a dialysis schedule and a night nurse who calls me at 2 in the morning when her blood pressure spikes. Whatever leverage you think you have. I didn't come here to leverage you. His voice didn't change. That was the most unsettling thing about it, the complete absence of defensiveness, of ego, of the need to perform. He simply said the true thing, and waited. I came here because I've been watching this diner for 3 weeks and tonight was the 3rd time that man put his hands on you, and I find I'm no longer interested in watching. Elodie stared at him. You've been watching me for 3 weeks. Yes. She stopped. Reorganized. That's not the comfort you seem to think it is. It isn't meant to be a comfort. It's meant to be the truth. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, she tracked the movement instinctively, couldn't help it, and withdrew a single folded document. He placed it on the table between them and slid it toward her with one finger, like a chess piece advanced on a board. I'm offering you a position. She didn't touch it. What kind of position? Personal assistant. My current one resigned last month, family matter, she relocated. I require someone organized, discreet, and capable of managing complex financial correspondence. He glanced at her once, brief and thorough. You have a business degree from Aldrin University. Graduated in the top 4% of your cohort. Your thesis was on asset restructuring in distressed mid-market firms. A beat. You've been waitressing for 11 months. The accuracy of it was almost violent. How? It's my business to know things. He nodded at the document. The terms are straightforward. A salary, structured over 18 months, that services the debt in full and leaves you with a working surplus. You'll be based out of my offices on the 32nd floor of Voss Tower. Standard hours with irregular exceptions, my schedule isn't always predictable. You'll sign a confidentiality agreement. Standard language, nothing unreasonable. Elodie pulled the document toward her then and read it. Actually read it, every clause, every subclause, while Cyprian sat across from her in perfect silence, which she also noted. Most men grew restless when she took time to think. They filled the space with noise, with pressure, with the low-grade hostility of people unused to waiting. Cyprian simply waited. Like a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that things worth having required patience. The numbers were real. The salary was more than real, it was generous in a way that made her immediately suspicious, because nothing in her life had ever been generous without a mechanism hidden inside it. She set the document down. And my mother's debt, while I'm working it off, she's protected? No collection activity, no interest accumulation, no. Frozen. Entirely. From tonight. In writing. He reached into his jacket again and produced a second document, already signed on his end, and laid it beside the first. She looked at both papers. Then at him. Then at the diner around her, the sticky laminate menus, the flickering bulb above the corner table she'd been meaning to report for 6 weeks, the mop bucket Greta had left beside the kitchen door, the handprint Barnaby Keach had left on her wrist that was already blooming into a bruise the color of a bad decision. You said you bought the debt 6 weeks ago, she said. Yes. Why wait? Why not come to me then? The question seemed to interest him, a shift behind his eyes, almost imperceptible, like a depth she hadn't seen before catching the light. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. Thinking. Because 6 weeks ago you hadn't yet made the choice I needed to see you make, he said finally. What choice? To stay. His gaze moved over her face, unhurried, leaving no feature unexamined. Every morning you come back here. Every shift you finish. Every time a man like Barnaby tests you, you recalibrate and continue. You don't run from difficulty, Elodie. You systematize it. Something in his voice dropped half a register. I don't hire people who run. She held his gaze for a long moment. The city hummed beyond the windows. Her feet ached with 9 hours of standing. She picked up the pen he hadn't offered but somehow she'd known would be there, laid beside the documents at some point she hadn't caught, and signed her name in the clean, decisive hand of a woman who was done being underestimated. Cyprian Voss looked at her signature. Then at her. Good, he said. Just that. But the word carried the full weight of everything he hadn't yet said, and somehow, that was worse. She already knew she was in trouble. The car that collected her the following morning was black, long, and obscenely quiet, the kind of vehicle that didn't make noise because it had never needed to announce itself. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Fenn who communicated exclusively in single syllables, loaded her 2 suitcases into the boot with the brisk efficiency of someone who had moved people before and would move them again and felt nothing particular about either. Elodie sat in the back and watched Legos thin into something else entirely. She'd expected an office building. She'd read personal assistant, processed the 32nd floor, constructed a mental image of glass partitions and ergonomic furniture and the specific kind of corporate anonymity that swallowed people whole and paid them well enough that they didn't mind. She had not expected the gates. They were iron, old, and tall enough to make a point, flanked by stone pillars that had been standing long before the city grew up around them, before the towers went up and the roads widened and the world decided that power should look modern. The Voss estate had made no such concession. It sat behind its gates the way old money always sat, assured, unhurried, entirely indifferent to your opinion of it. The house itself was worse. Better. She couldn't decide. It was the kind of architecture that had been built to last centuries and knew it: dark stone, high windows, the geometry of old authority rendered in mortar and glass. Ivy had colonized the eastern wing with what looked like permission. The grounds rolled away from the main structure in every direction, manicured but not fussy, the way a man kept himself when he didn't need to impress anyone. Fenn brought the car to a stop at the front entrance and was out of the driver's seat before she'd finished processing the facade. Your rooms are in the east corridor, he said, retrieving her cases. 3rd floor. Mr. Voss will see you at 9. It's 8:47, she said. Yes. She followed him inside. The interior hit her differently than the exterior, warmer, unexpectedly, with the kind of warmth that didn't come from temperature but from density. Books everywhere. Not decorative books, not the curated spines of a man performing intellect, but read books, stacked on surfaces, opened and inverted on side tables, flagged with paper slips. Dark wood throughout, brass fittings worn to a soft gleam, art on the walls that was serious and occasionally unsettling. A house that had been lived in by someone who actually lived, which surprised her in ways she couldn't yet fully articulate. Her rooms were large and impersonal in the specific way of spaces that had been prepared rather than inhabited. Clean lines, neutral palette, a desk by the window that caught the morning light at an angle that would have delighted her, under different circumstances. She stood in the center of the room for exactly 90 seconds, taking inventory, and then she unpacked, methodically, efficiently, and went to find Cyprian Voss at 9 o'clock precisely. He was in the study. Standing at the window with his back to the door, jacket off, sleeves pushed to the elbow, and she saw for the first time the full geography of the ink that had been hinting above his collar since last night. It ran up both forearms in dense, deliberate patterns, geometric, architectural, the kind of tattooing that required a decision made in full sobriety and kept. It should have made him look dangerous. It did make him look dangerous. It also made him look like a man with a long memory and a precise relationship with permanence. He turned when she entered. His eyes moved over her once, the same assessing sweep she was already cataloging as a habit, and he nodded at the chair across from his desk. You're on time. You noticed. I always notice. He moved to the desk and opened a leather-bound folder. I'll orient you to the operational structure this morning. By afternoon you'll have access to the correspondence archive. There are 17 outstanding matters requiring prioritization. I'll want your assessment by end of day. 17. Is that a problem? No, she said, and meant it. I just want to know what I'm walking into. He considered her for a moment. An honest answer, or a comfortable one? I don't have much use for comfortable. Something shifted in his expression, that same subterranean movement she'd caught last night, the depth surfacing briefly before he drew it back down. The Voss family operates across 12 verticals. 7 are fully legitimate: property, logistics, hospitality, private equity, and 3 others you'll encounter in the archive. The remaining 5 are not. He said it the way a surgeon described a condition, accurately, without cruelty, without apology. You'll have visibility into the legitimate operations only. What exists beyond that boundary is not your concern, and I'd strongly advise you to treat it that way. Elodie absorbed this. And if I encounter something that crosses that boundary accidentally? Bring it to me. Immediately. Not to Fen, not to anyone else in this house. Me. His voice didn't change in temperature, but something in it became absolute. There are people in my world who would interpret your curiosity as a liability, Elodie. I am not one of them. But I am the only one with the authority to manage that distinction. She understood what he was telling her without requiring it to be spelled out further. This house had edges. The warmth of it, the books and the brass fittings and the ivy on the stone, was real, but it was real the way the surface of deep water was real. What moved underneath it was a separate matter entirely. I understand, she said. Good. The day unfolded with a discipline that almost soothed her. She worked through the correspondence archive with the focused intensity she'd spent 3 years at Aldrin University developing and another 11 months slowly suffocating beneath the demands of Harlow's. The work was complex, genuinely, bracingly complex, and she felt the specific pleasure of a mind given adequate material, the click of things slotting into place, patterns emerging from what had looked like noise. By 3 in the afternoon she had prioritized all 17 matters, flagged 2 anomalies she couldn't fully account for, and drafted preliminary responses to 9 of them in the clean, precise language of someone who understood that the right word in a business document was often the difference between a closed door and an open war. She brought the folder to Cyprian's study at 4. He read through it without comment, which she was learning was its own form of language. Then he reached the 2 flagged anomalies and went still in the way that she now recognized, the predator's stillness, the controlled restraint, and she felt the atmosphere in the room shift fractionally, the way it had shifted in Harlow's the night before. Where did you find these? He asked. Correspondence from a subsidiary account. The routing numbers don't match the entity listed as originator. It could be a clerical error, but the pattern repeats across 4 separate transactions over 6 weeks. He looked at her then. Fully, with a weight that pressed against her sternum. It's not a clerical error, he said quietly. She had known it wasn't. She'd known it the moment she'd seen it, the same way she'd always known when a number was lying, a talent she'd had since childhood that her professors had called analytical instinct and that she privately thought of as simply paying attention in a world that rewarded inattention. There's a leak, she said. Yes. He closed the folder. His jaw was set, his eyes somewhere past her, running calculations of his own. Then he brought his gaze back to her face and she saw something in it she hadn't seen before, not warmth exactly, not yet, but its antecedent. The thing that came before warmth. Recognition. You've been here one day, he said. 11 hours, she corrected. He almost smiled. Almost. Go and eat something, he said. You'll need your strength. She didn't ask what for. She was already beginning to understand that in Cyprian Voss's world, the answer to that question was always everything. She found the leak on a Thursday. It lived inside a shell company called Meridian Brace Holdings, 3 words that meant nothing, which was precisely the point, nested inside a logistics subsidiary that filed quarterly returns with the kind of aggressive tidiness that should have raised flags months ago. Elodie had been following the thread for 4 days, pulling on numbers the way a surgeon pulled on sutures, careful not to sever what she needed intact, and when the full shape of it finally emerged from the data, she sat very still at her desk for a long moment and simply breathed. Then she printed it, clipped it, and brought it to Cyprian. He was on the phone when she entered, standing at the window again, which she'd begun to understand was his thinking position, the place he went when something required the full geography of his attention. He held up one finger without turning around. She waited. He finished the call in a language she didn't speak, his voice low and unbothered, and turned to find her holding a 12-page document with color-coded annotations and a summary page that reduced 4 weeks of financial misdirection to 11 precise sentences. He read the summary first. Then the full document. Then the summary again. Meridian Brace, he said. Registered 18 months ago. Dormant for the first 6, then activated with small transfers, small enough to miss if you weren't looking at the aggregate pattern. Whoever set it up understood your reporting structure well enough to stay inside the noise threshold. She paused. It's someone internal, Cyprian. Or someone who used to be. He set the document on the desk with a deliberateness that she recognized as controlled anger, not the hot, performative kind she'd grown accustomed to in men, but the cold, architectural kind that built itself into decisions rather than displays. I'll handle it, he said. I know. She turned to leave. Elodie. She stopped. This is good work. He said it simply, without ornament, and she felt the specific weight of a compliment from a man who didn't distribute them carelessly. Thank you. She nodded and left before her face could do anything she'd regret. The fracture arrived the following evening, and it arrived in the shape of Barnaby Keach. She was in the ground floor reception hall, retrieving a document Fenn had signed for in her absence, when she heard the voice. It hit her before she consciously identified it, the way certain sounds operate below the level of thought, landing in the body first. Her shoulders drew together. Her jaw tightened. She turned. He looked smaller here than he had in Harlow's. That was the first thing she noticed, how a man who had seemed substantial in a diner booth was reduced to something considerably less impressive in the entrance hall of a house that had been built to make people understand proportion. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than his character warranted and the same soft, oily confidence she remembered, though it had curdled slightly at the edges. He was speaking to one of Cyprian's men, a broad, quiet figure named Rourke, with the forced casualness of someone performing ease they didn't feel. Then he saw her. Elodie. He said her name the way he always had, like something he'd already decided belonged to him. His smile arrived, that particular arrangement of features she associated with hands that didn't wait for permission. Small world. Not small enough, she said. Rourke's eyes moved between them with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to react until he had more information. Barnaby spread his hands, a gesture of wounded innocence so well rehearsed it must have been decades in development. I'm here on business. I didn't know you'd. He glanced around the hall, recalibrated, landed somewhere so comfortable. What business? She said. Not a question. A wall. That's between me and Mr. Voss. His eyes moved over her in the old way and she felt her skin register the wrongness of it the way skin always did, a cellular-level rejection, the body's honest intelligence unclouded by social obligation. Although I have to say, it's a surprise. I didn't take you for the type to, how do I put this, leverage your assets so creatively. The silence that followed was total. She became aware of Cyprian behind her before she heard him, that same barometric shift she'd felt in Harlow's, the change in air pressure that preceded him the way weather preceded itself. He came to stand beside her, not in front, not between, beside, and that positioning was deliberate, she understood, a statement about adjacency rather than ownership. Keach, he said. Barnaby's smile recalibrated instantly. Mr. Voss. I was just saying to Elodie. I heard what you were saying. Cyprian's voice was pleasant in the way that very cold things were pleasant, clarifying, precise, stripped of all ambiguity. His eyes moved to Rourke. Show Mr. Keach to the East meeting room. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Then, to Barnaby, without looking at him again, don't speak to her. Barnaby left. The room rearranged itself in his absence. Cyprian turned to Elodie and she saw it then, the thing she hadn't expected, the thing that complicated everything. It was brief and he drew it back almost immediately, locked it behind the controlled surface he wore like second skin, but she caught it in the half-second before he did. A tightness around his eyes. A muscle in his jaw that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something older and less manageable. Are you all right? He asked. I'm fine. She kept her voice level. Who is he to you? A pause. Measured, not evasive. Until recently, a peripheral associate of a group we've had commercial disputes with. A man named Delacourt runs it, mid-tier operation with significant ambitions and insufficient foundation. He looked at her directly. Keach is low-level. An errand runner with pretensions. He shouldn't have had this address. The implication settled between them like sediment. He was in Harlow's, she said slowly. The night you came in. He wasn't there by accident. No, Cyprian said. He wasn't. She thought about that, about the 3 weeks he'd told her he'd been watching, about Barnaby's pattern of escalation, about the debt that had been sold and the address that shouldn't have been shared and the shape of it all when you laid the pieces flat and looked at them without flinching. They were using me, she said. To get to you. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of a man who had already run this calculation many times and disliked the result on every pass. They were trying to, he said. They underestimated several things. Such as? His eyes moved over her face with that specific attention she was still learning to withstand, the gaze that didn't take, but assessed, and somehow that was more difficult to deflect than taking had ever been. Your intelligence, he said. And my patience. A beat, low and absolute. They won't make that mistake again. He left for the East meeting room and Elodie stood alone in the hall with the document still in her hand, understanding, with the clarity of a woman who had always been better at reading numbers than she was at reading herself, that the danger in this house was no longer limited to the world outside it. Some of it lived in the way he'd said beside instead of behind. And God help her, she wasn't entirely sure she minded. The dress arrived on a Friday morning with no note. It was hanging on the back of her bedroom door when she woke, deep black, structured at the shoulder, falling in clean lines that suggested the hand of someone who understood the difference between clothing that decorated a woman and clothing that armed her. Beside it, a small box containing a single piece of jewelry, a cuff of dark gold, architectural, the kind of thing that didn't ask for attention but received it regardless. She stood in the doorway of her room in her robe and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went and found Cyprian at breakfast. He was at the long table in the morning room with 3 phones, a newspaper, and an espresso he hadn't touched, reading something that made his jaw do the controlled anger thing she'd catalogued 17 separate times in the past 2 weeks. He looked up when she entered. There's a dress in my room, she said. There is. You could have asked me. I could have. He returned to the document. We leave at 7. The event is the Aldrin Foundation Gala, annually the most significant gathering of legitimate commercial interest in the city. 80% of the attendees have some relationship, direct or peripheral, with Voss Holdings. He turned a page. I need a second set of eyes. Yours, specifically. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Why mine specifically? He set the document down then and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that she'd stopped pretending didn't affect her. Because in 3 weeks you've reorganized my correspondence archive, identified a financial leak my own people missed for 6 months, and annotated a subsidiary restructure proposal with 17 corrections, 14 of which I implemented. He picked up his espresso. I don't bring decoration to these events, Elodie. I bring instruments. She absorbed that. Decided it was the most backhanded compliment she'd ever received and also possibly the most sincere. What am I looking for? She asked. I'll tell you on the way. The gala occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Grand, which she noted with private irony, given what she now associated with that word, and it was exactly the kind of event that had existed at the edge of her awareness all through university. The kind her professors attended and returned from speaking about in the careful language of people who'd been near real money and were still recalibrating. Crystal and candlelight, the rustle of serious fabric, conversation conducted at a register that was warm on the surface and transactional 6 inches underneath. She walked in beside Cyprian and felt the room adjust. Not to her. To him. The subtle reorganization of attention, the shift in posture among the men who saw him first, the recalculation happening behind careful eyes, she'd felt the edges of it in Harlow's and in the estate, but here, in a room full of people who understood power and its specific grammar, it was something else entirely. He moved through it like a stone through water, generating wake without apparent effort, and the hand he placed briefly at the small of her back as they crossed the threshold was light enough to be almost nothing and heavy enough to say everything. She kept her expression neutral and her spine straight and catalogued the room in the way she catalogued everything, quickly, systematically, looking for pattern and anomaly in equal measure. He leaned down slightly. Delacourt has 2 people here tonight. I know one of them. The other is someone I haven't been able to identify, a conduit, we believe, placed inside my legitimate operations. They'll be watching me. Which means they'll be watching you. So I'm also bait. You're also an analyst. The bait is incidental. A pause, low near her ear. Stay close and tell me what you notice. What she noticed, in the first 40 minutes, was a great deal. She noticed the way certain people tracked Cyprian's movement without appearing to, the overcorrection of studied indifference, the glance held a beat too long before redirecting. She noticed the man near the bar who laughed too readily at his companion's remarks, the specific falseness of performed ease. She noticed the woman in slate gray near the east window who had been nursing the same drink for 30 minutes, whose eyes moved in the systematic pattern of someone conducting surveillance rather than socializing. But what she noticed most acutely was the man who came to shake Cyprian's hand at the 43-minute mark, a mid-40s figure named Harwick, introduced as a senior compliance officer within Voss Property Holdings, whose handshake was warm and whose smile was generous and whose left cufflink, when it caught the light as he reached forward, bore an insignia she had seen before. She'd seen it in the Meridian brace file. It was small, a stylized geometry, the kind of thing that looked like personal taste and functioned as identification. She'd noticed it in the scanned documentation because she noticed everything that repeated without explanation, and it had repeated twice in the Meridian brace correspondence on items that had no reason to share a visual element. She said nothing. She smiled at Harwick with the pleasant, unreadable expression she developed in 11 months of waitressing and noted every detail of him with the focused intensity of a woman who had learned that attention was the only currency that never depreciated. When he moved away, she leaned slightly toward Cyprian. Harwick, she said quietly. Compliance officer, Voss Property. 14 years. Loyal as furniture. His voice was even, but she felt the quality of his attention sharpen. Why? His cufflink bears the same mark as 2 documents in the Meridian brace file. Page 7 and page 11. I flagged them as anomalous design elements and didn't know what I was looking at. I do now. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Are you certain? I have a memory for visual pattern that borders on inconvenient, she said. Yes. I'm certain. He didn't move. Didn't look at Harwick. Didn't alter his expression by a single degree. He simply reached for 2 glasses from a passing tray, handed her one, and touched his glass to hers with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a private acknowledgement that had nothing to do with the event around them. 14 years, he said again, but differently this time. The way you said something when you were revising an entire structure built on a false assumption. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Betrayal at that proximity was its own category of damage, and she was not so far removed from ordinary human feeling that she didn't understand what it cost him to hear it. He looked at her then, fully, the way he did when he'd stopped calculating and was simply seeing, and something in his expression did the thing it rarely did. It opened. Briefly, barely, the way a door opened when the person behind it had decided, not quite consciously, that the person on the other side had earned the fraction. Don't apologize, he said. You just saved me a war. His eyes stayed on her face a moment longer than function required. Dance with me. It wasn't a question. It was also, she was beginning to understand, never quite a command. It was something in between, the specific register of a man who asked by stating, who requested by deciding, who had spent so long being obeyed that the architecture of asking had been rebuilt from its foundation. She let him lead her to the floor. And if her pulse did something entirely unprofessional when his hands settled at her waist, she kept that particular data point entirely to herself. They didn't speak on the drive home. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who had run out of things to say, but the rarer kind, the silence of 2 people who had too much, suddenly, and were each waiting for the other to decide what to do with the weight of it. The city moved past the windows in amber and dark. Elodie watched it without seeing it, her hands folded in her lap, the gold cuff cool against her wrist, the memory of his hand at her waist doing something she refused to examine directly. Fen brought the car through the gates at 11:30. Cyprian was out first, as always, and she'd learned by now not to read anything into the way he waited at the bottom of the steps while she crossed the gravel. It was courtesy, she'd decided, the ingrained habit of a man raised in a world with specific codes of conduct, however dark the world itself might be. She climbed the steps and he followed, and they came through the front door into the quiet of the house, which at this hour had the particular quality of held breath. She should have gone upstairs. She knew it the way you knew things that you were going to do anyway, with full clarity, complete self-awareness, and an absolute inability to act on either. Drink, he said. Yes, she said. The study again. It was always the study, the room that had accumulated the most of him, that smelled of old books and something darker underneath, cedar and cold air and the faint ghost of a cologne that had long since become indistinguishable from the man himself. He poured 2 glasses of something amber without asking her preference, which should have irritated her and somehow didn't, because he'd set the glass exactly where her hand reached and the pour was precisely what she would have asked for. She stood at the bookshelves while he settled into the chair behind the desk, jacket off, the ink of his forearms catching the lamplight, and she pulled a book without looking at it and turned it over in her hands just to have something to do with them. Harwick has been dealt with, he said. Already. I made 2 calls from the car. He's been suspended pending a full audit, access revoked. By Monday, everything he touched will have been reviewed. A pause. It would have taken us months to find him through conventional channels. Possibly longer. The cufflink was careless of him. People get comfortable, Cyprian said. They're in a position long enough and they start to believe they're invisible. That the structure around them exists to protect them rather than the other way around. He turned the glass slowly in his hand. It's a consistent failure of the comfortable. She replaced the book she hadn't read. Is that what you tell yourself? To avoid it? I tell myself that comfort is a debt, he said. That everything soft has a cost attached to it that comes due eventually. So I don't accumulate what I can't afford to lose. She turned from the bookshelf and looked at him. The lamplight made the study into a painting, all amber and shadow, the lines of him precise and still, the room arranged around him the way rooms always seem to arrange themselves around Cyprian Voss, as though even inanimate things understood where the center of gravity was. "That sounds like a very efficient way to be alone," she said. The silence that followed was different from the one in the car. This one had texture. She felt it against her skin. "It has been efficient," he said. Yes. She should have let it rest there. She had a well-developed instinct for the edges of things, for the line between a conversation that was simply honest and one that was about to become something else, and she could feel the line from where she was standing. She was discovering, less interested in stopping at lines than she had previously given herself credit for. "Why did you buy the debt, Cyprian?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might redirect her, deflect with logistics, with the clean language of business justification that he kept ready for most things. Then he set his glass down. "Vivian Murtha's debt was acquired through a portfolio purchase," he said. 47 individual debts from a distressed lending firm, bought in bulk. The others were assigned to a recovery division and managed accordingly. A pause. Hers wasn't. Elodie was very still. "I separated it from the portfolio the same day," he said. "Froze the interest. Ensured the medical payments continued without interruption." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "That was 9 months ago." 9 months. She ran the number twice before she let herself respond to it. For 9 months, you've been covering her treatment costs. Through a third party, anonymized." "Yes." The room felt different. She set her glass down carefully because her hands weren't entirely steady and she was unwilling to let him see that. "I don't understand. You didn't know me 9 months ago." "No," he said. "I didn't." "Then why?" "Because I saw you." He said it plainly, without performance, the way he said all true things. "I was in Harlow's 14 months ago, a meeting, nothing significant. You weren't my waitress. You were 2 tables over, dealing with a man who'd been running his mouth for 20 minutes, and you handled it with a precision and a dignity that I found." He paused, searching for the word with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, remarkable. "I looked into you. Not deeply, not then. Enough to know your name, your situation. Enough to know the debt was a mechanism being used against someone who deserved better than mechanisms." Elodie said nothing. She was doing what she did with data she didn't yet know how to process, holding it flat, examining it from multiple angles, refusing to reach a conclusion before she had the full picture. "And then," she said. "And then I kept looking." He stood then, not toward her, just upright, the movement of a man who needed to be vertical for what he was about to say. "Once a week. Sometimes more. I told myself it was due diligence. That you were adjacent to a debt my family held and it was reasonable to monitor the situation." He was quiet for a moment. "I stopped believing that approximately 4 months in." "What did you believe instead?" He looked at her across the study with the expression she'd been cataloging for weeks and had never been able to fully name, the one that wasn't hunger and wasn't warmth but was the precondition of both, the thing that lived underneath them. "That I was watching a woman carry a weight that wasn't hers to carry," he said. "That the world was making significant use of her grace and giving nothing back. And that I found I was no longer willing to simply observe that." The fire had burned low. The city was silent beyond the windows. Elodie stood in the amber light of a room full of his books and his history and the accumulated weight of a man who had told her, just now, something she suspected he had told no one. She crossed the room. Not all the way, she wasn't ready for all the way, and neither, she thought, was he, not tonight, not with this much still unsettled between them. But close enough that the distance became a choice rather than a default. Close enough that she could see, in the low light, the precise moment his breath changed. She looked up at him. 9 months is a long time to watch someone, she said softly. Yes, he said. His voice had dropped to something she felt more than heard. You could have come sooner. I know. Why didn't you? He reached up then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man disarming rather than reaching, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with 2 fingers. The touch was brief. Barely there. It rearranged everything. Because you weren't ready for my world, he said. And I wasn't ready to apologize for it. She held his gaze in the firelit dark and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of a woman who had always been better at truth than comfort, that she was in love with a man who was going to cost her something significant. She also understood, with the same unflinching honesty, that she was going to pay it anyway. She stepped back. He let her. They finished their drinks in the reconfigured silence of 2 people who had crossed a line they hadn't named yet and were each, privately, deciding they didn't want to go back. She found the anomaly at 6:47 in the morning. It lived, as the worst things often did, inside something ordinary, a routine access log from the estate server system, time-stamped between 2 and 4 in the morning, during the window when the house was at its quietest and the security rotation thinned to its minimum. Someone had accessed the internal communications archive. Not clumsily, not with the blunt force of someone breaking in, but with valid credentials, moving through the system with the practiced ease of familiarity. Harwick's credentials. Suspended, revoked, supposedly dead in the water. Except they weren't. She was at Cyprian's door in 3 minutes, still in yesterday's clothes because she hadn't slept, and she knocked twice with the flat of her hand, not tentative, not frantic, the specific knock of someone who had something he needed to hear immediately. He opened the door within seconds, which told her he hadn't slept either. He was dressed, or nearly, shirt open at the collar, jaw carrying the shadow of a night spent doing whatever Cyprian Voss did in the hours the rest of the world surrendered to unconsciousness. He read her face before she spoke. Show me, he said. She showed him. He stood at her desk in the pale morning light and moved through the access log with the focused silence of a man cataloging a threat rather than reacting to it. His expression didn't change. That, she had learned, was the most dangerous version of him, not the controlled anger, not the cold authority, but the absolute stillness of a man who had moved past feeling into the clean, stripped territory of decision. They have the estate layout, he said. And the security rotation schedule. It was in the communications archive, a memo from 3 weeks ago. She paused. Cyprian. They know when the perimeter is thinnest. He looked at her. When did you find this? 40 minutes ago. And you came straight to me. Obviously. Something moved across his face, brief and unguarded, and she catalogued it alongside everything else she'd been collecting, every undefended moment, every fracture in the surface, every piece of evidence that the man underneath the empire was more complex and more costly than she'd originally accounted for. He straightened and reached for his phone. What followed was the most efficiently choreographed 40 minutes of Elodie's life. Fen materialized from somewhere. Rourke appeared at the top of the stairs with 2 other men she recognized from the estate's outer security. Cyprian moved through the house issuing instructions in the low, precise cadence of a man running a field operation, which she supposed was exactly what he was doing, and the house transformed around her, from the amber and book-lined sanctuary she'd been navigating for weeks into something older and harder underneath, the estate's actual nature surfacing through its cultivated warmth like bone through skin. She stood in the corridor outside the study and understood, with absolute clarity, that she was being given a moment. Fen appeared at her shoulder with the specific body language of a man executing an instruction he hadn't authored. There's a car at the east entrance, he said. Mr. Voss has arranged a safe location, discreet, outside the city. I can have you there in under an hour. She looked at him. Did he ask you to tell me that? or tell you to take me? A pause. Tell me to offer it. She turned back to the corridor. Through the study door she could see Cyprian at the window, his preferred position, the place he went when things required the full weight of his attention, speaking into the phone in a voice too low to carry. His shoulders were set. His free hand was still, which she now understood meant the opposite of stillness. She thought about the car. She thought about the safe location outside the city, some clean, anonymous room where she would wait with the specific powerlessness of someone who had been removed from events for their own protection, who would learn what happened secondhand, after the fact, in whatever form he chose to deliver it. She thought about her mother, and the debt, and the 9 months of anonymous protection, and the study at midnight, and 2 fingers tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with the care of a man who had forgotten, briefly, to be careful. She turned back to Fen. Tell him I'm staying, she said. Fen looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he nodded, once, and left. The attempt came at dusk. In retrospect she would understand the elegance of the timing, not the small hours window they'd telegraphed through the access security schedule, but the legitimate changeover at shift's end, when attention was distributed across transition rather than fixed on the perimeter. The first indication was a sound she didn't recognize and Rourke did, something percussive and wrong at the estate's southern boundary, and then the house was moving again, faster this time, with the specific urgency of a situation that had crossed from anticipated to actual. Cyprian was at her side before she'd fully processed the sound. Interior corridor, he said. Now. I'm not. Elodie. His hand closed around her arm, not rough, not gentle, firm, with the pressure of someone who needed her to understand that this was not a moment for negotiation. His eyes were on her face, dark and absolute. I need to know you're contained. I cannot function if I don't know where you are. She went. The interior corridor ran through the oldest section of the estate, stone rather than plaster, narrower, with a low ceiling that amplified every sound from outside into something larger and closer than it was. She sat on a wooden chair that had no business being as uncomfortable as it was and listened to the controlled chaos at the edges of the house and felt, for the first time since Harlow's diner, genuinely frightened. Not for herself, or not only for herself, for the man moving through the outer rooms with the stillness of a predator and the weight of an entire organization pressing down on every decision he made. She was not built for waiting. She had never been built for waiting. She had, however, been built for thinking. She pulled out her phone and opened the access logs she'd screenshotted that morning and read them again, carefully, looking for the thing she'd been too urgently focused to find the first time. The log showed entry points, timestamps, the path through the system, and there, nested in the metadata, something she'd processed as background noise at 6:47 in the morning. A location ping. Automatic, embedded in the credentialing system, a ghost of a signal from the device that had accessed Harwick's credentials. She ran it twice to be certain. Then she sent it to Cyprian's number with 4 words beneath it. They're inside already. North Wing. The reply came in 11 seconds. A single character. A checkmark. The sounds from the outer rooms changed then, a shift in pattern she felt more than heard, the reorganization of threat into something being managed rather than something managing, and she sat in the stone corridor and kept her breathing level and refused, with every mechanism of will she possessed, to imagine the alternative. He came for her 40 minutes later. He was not unscathed. There was a cut along his left jaw, shallow but definitive, and his shirt was carrying evidence of a night that had been significantly more physical than the tailored lines of his wardrobe generally implied. He stood in the entrance to the corridor and looked at her with an expression she had no existing category for, something that had passed through relief on its way to becoming something rawer and less governable. She stood up. The ping, he said. Metadata. In the access log. It led us directly to them. He crossed the corridor in 3 strides and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the precise geography of the cut, close enough that his breathing was audible. "You stayed." "Yes. I told Fen to offer you the car." "I know what you told Fen." He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man encountering something he'd prepared for only theoretically, a possibility he'd held at arm's length, inside the controlled architecture of his own careful distances, that had just walked through every boundary he'd constructed and stood in front of him breathing. His hand came up and cupped the side of her face, and this time it wasn't 2 fingers, careful and brief. It was his whole hand, warm and certain, and his thumb traced a line beneath her eye with the reverence of a man touching something he'd been afraid, for a very long time, to want. "You should have taken the car," he said. His voice was barely above nothing. "Probably," she said. Neither of them moved. Outside, the estate settled back into its cultivated quiet. Inside, in the stone corridor, 2 people stood at the edge of the last distance between them and held it, not because they wanted to keep it, but because they both understood, in the clear-eyed way of people who had survived the evening, that when they crossed it, everything would change. They were simply deciding, together and without words, that they were ready for everything to change. 3 days after the corridor, Delacourt made his real move. Not a probe this time. Not the careful, deniable pressure of accessed credentials and strategic information leaks. This was something different in character entirely, the shift from intelligence gathering to declaration, from testing the edges of a structure to attempting to bring it down. Elodie understood the distinction because she'd spent 3 weeks organizing Cyprian's operational files, and the grammar of escalation was the same in criminal enterprise as it was in distressed corporate finance. When a rival stopped being subtle, it meant one of 2 things. Either they'd gathered everything they needed and were moving to close. Or they were afraid, and fear had accelerated their timeline past the point of discipline. She was almost certain it was the latter. The morning began without indication. Cyprian was in the East Wing meeting room with Rourke and 2 other figures she recognized as senior in the hierarchy, faces that appeared in the correspondence archive attached to decisions rather than requests, and she was at her desk working through a property acquisition proposal that required 3 separate regulatory filings before the end of the month. The house had the specific quiet of a place that had recently been through something and was recollecting itself. The cut on Cyprian's jaw had closed to a thin line. They had not spoken of the corridor. They had, however, been speaking differently to each other since. Not softer exactly, Cyprian Voss did not do soft, but with a reduced distance. A shortened interval between thought and expression. The particular ease of 2 people who have stopped performing indifference and haven't yet decided what to perform instead. The first explosion was distant enough that she felt it before she heard it. A vibration in the floor, subauditory, the kind of displacement that registered in the body's oldest mechanisms before the conscious mind caught up. She was on her feet before she understood why, and then the sound arrived, not large, not the cinematic detonation of popular imagination, but a contained, professional percussion from somewhere beyond the estate's northern perimeter that told her everything she needed to know about what kind of people were coming. The house was already moving. She grabbed her laptop and the external drive she'd been using to maintain the operational database, 12 weeks of organized correspondence, security protocols, personnel files, asset maps, and ran for the corridor outside the study. Fen appeared from the direction of the East Wing with the controlled urgency of a man executing a plan that was no longer operating under its original assumptions. "Mr. Voss," she said. "East Wing. Stay." I know, interior corridor." She was already running the other direction. She found Cyprian coming out of the meeting room with Rourke at his shoulder and the 2 senior men behind him, and the first thing she registered was wrong. The way he was moving, the fractional asymmetry of it, the left hand held slightly away from his body with the careful stillness of something that hurt. "You're injured," she said. "It's minor." That's what people say about things that aren't minor. She fell into step beside him. "How bad?" "Manageable." He looked at her, briefly, with the expression she'd learned to read as both reassurance and deflection. The perimeter breach is northern and eastern simultaneously. They anticipated the rotation gap. They didn't, she said. They thought they anticipated it. The rotation gap they accessed in the schedule was the one from 3 weeks ago. I updated it 6 days ago. She held up the external drive. I have the current protocols. All of them. Updated, annotated, with the personnel assignments from this morning's briefing. He stopped walking and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on something that was, underneath the urgency and the cut and the controlled management of whatever was happening with his left hand, unmistakably and entirely focused. You updated the rotation, he said. After the breach I restructured the entire security schedule on a rolling 72-hour cycle. Randomized assignment windows, overlapping coverage on the historically thin periods. She paused. Rourke has been implementing it. He didn't tell you? Rourke, to his credit, maintained his expression with professional commitment. You said to operationalize it quietly until we'd confirmed it held. I said discreetly, she said. Not secretly. Cyprian looked between them with the particular expression of a man recalibrating in real time. Then, to Rourke, get her to the operations room. She runs the data coordination. And to Elodie, with a directness that bypassed every remaining distance between them, tell my people what they need to know. They'll listen. Where will you be? Managing the North Breach. Cyprian. Elodie. Her name in his mouth, the way he said it when something was absolute. Trust me. She did. She hated how completely she did. The operations room was 2 floors below ground, a space she'd known existed from the architectural files but hadn't entered, fitted with screens and communication equipment and a table large enough to seat 12, currently occupied by 6 people who looked up when she walked in with Rourke in a very clear expression of someone who did not intend to be argued with. She plugged in the drive and started talking. What she had, what 12 weeks of obsessive organization had produced, was a live operational map of the entire estate and its surrounding approaches, cross-referenced with personnel assignments, communication channels, and the security protocol updates she'd been quietly implementing since the breach. She could see, in the data, exactly where the incursion was densest, exactly where the coverage overlapped, and, critically, exactly where Delacourt's people had anticipated gaps that no longer existed. They're going to push hardest at the East Service entrance in approximately 8 minutes, she said, pulling up the approach pattern from the external cameras. That was the thinnest point in the old rotation. In the current one it has double coverage, Martinez and Holt on the ground, Brennan elevated. She looked at the man nearest the communications panel. Tell them to hold position and don't telegraph the coverage until contact. Let Delacourt's people commit to the approach. The man looked at Rourke. Rourke nodded. He told them. She ran the next 40 minutes on data and adrenaline, which was, she was discovering, not entirely different from running a complex financial restructure under deadline except that the variables were moving and some of them were armed. She tracked approach patterns, redirected personnel, identified a secondary incursion attempt at the western wall that the original protocols would have missed, and coordinated communication between 6 separate teams with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years learning to manage complex systems under pressure and 2 months learning that pressure had gradients she hadn't previously encountered. When it broke, when the momentum shifted from incursion to retreat, the pattern of it visible in the camera feeds and the communication channels going from urgent to controlled, she felt it in her own chest. The specific deflation of sustained high function, the body understanding before the mind that the immediate crisis had passed. She was still at the table, running post-incident position checks, when Cyprian walked in. He was pale beneath his composure and his left arm was now in a makeshift sling that someone had fashioned from what appeared to be a tactical vest strap. He was also, beneath all of it, looking at her with an expression that contained multitudes she didn't have the bandwidth to process yet. The room went quiet. East Service entrance, he said. They walked directly into double coverage. Yes. Western incursion was intercepted 40 seconds after they breached the wall. The camera angle on that approach had a blind spot in the old layout. I repositioned the feed 3 weeks ago. He crossed the room. Stopped in front of her. The table between them was irrelevant. He simply leaned forward and placed both hands on its surface and looked at her from a distance that was not a distance and said, quietly and with complete conviction, the truest thing he'd said since the study at midnight. You held this house together, he said. She met his gaze across the table. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was level and certain and carried the full weight of a woman who had finally, completely, stopped pretending she was just working off a debt. I know, she said. Now sit down before you fall down. He almost smiled. This time, it reached his eyes. He spent 2 days being still, which cost him more than the injury. Elodie understood this about him now, that inaction was its own category of damage for a man whose entire architecture was built around forward motion, around the management of variables and the precise application of will to circumstance. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his left shoulder cleanly, missing everything that mattered with the indifferent grace of luck, and the estate's private physician had done what needed doing with brisk, unsentimental efficiency. What remained was recovery, which Cyprian approached with the same focused displeasure of a man for whom rest had never been recuperation but simply time stolen from purpose. She brought him coffee at 7 on the first morning and found him already at his desk, left arm in the proper sling now, reading through the post-incident reports she'd compiled the previous night with the expression of someone who had rested precisely as much as biology had forced him to and not a moment more. He looked up. You should be sleeping, he said. You should be horizontal, she said. We're both disappointed. She set the coffee where she always set it and pulled the chair to its customary position across the desk, and they worked in the particular silence that had become, over 12 weeks, its own form of language. Companionable. Waited. The silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill space with noise because the space itself had become sufficient. On the second day she found him standing at the window. She said nothing. She crossed the study and stood beside him and looked at the grounds below, the estate restored to its cultivated surface, the evidence of 3 nights ago absorbed back into the stone and the ivy and the deliberate stillness that the Voss house wore like a permanent expression, and she was close enough that their arms were almost touching and neither of them moved to correct it. Delacourt made a mistake, Cyprian said. Not to her specifically. To the window, to the thought. Several, she said. Which one are you thinking about? He touched what was mine. The words were quiet and entirely without performance. Not threat, not declaration, observation, stated with the flat certainty of a man describing a law of physics. He turned from the window then and looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing that had been building since the corridor, since the study at midnight, since a dance floor in the Meridian Grand where his hand had settled at her waist like a decision made and kept. It was resolved now. Whatever internal negotiation he'd been conducting in the 2 days of enforced stillness had reached its conclusion. I'm going to need you to stay inside the estate for the next 72 hours. What happens in 72 hours? It ends, he said. She didn't ask him to elaborate. She understood, by now, that there were boundaries to her visibility into his world that existed not to diminish her but to protect her in ways that she was still developing the language to accept. What she understood was the expression on his face and the quality of the decision behind it, and both told her that Delacourt had made the last miscalculation of his particular career. Be careful, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the unguarded expression she'd been collecting like evidence. Then he reached out and touched her face, the same gesture as the corridor, warm and certain, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that still surprised her every time, the way genuine things surprised you when you'd spent long enough in a world that substituted performance for feeling. Always, he said. And left. What followed was 3 days she experienced primarily through data and second-hand information, which was its own particular form of exquisite frustration for a woman whose primary mechanism for managing uncertainty was direct engagement with it. Fen kept her updated in the minimal way of a man who shared exactly what he'd been authorized to share and nothing beyond it. Rourke checked in twice daily with the specific body language of someone executing a pastoral instruction alongside his operational ones. Cyprian called on the second evening. She picked up before the first ring had finished. "I'm fine," he said, before she spoke. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." She was. "Where are you?" "Handling something. I'll be back tomorrow." A pause, and in it she heard the specific quality of a connection between two people who have passed the point of requiring complete sentences. "Are you all right?" "I'm organizing your hospitality division's Q3 projections and I've identified 4 separate inefficiencies in the revenue reporting structure that are costing you approximately $800,000 annually." She paused. "So yes. I'm coping." The sound he made was low and brief and she filed it under the category she'd created 3 weeks ago and labeled simply "almost smiling," a category that had grown considerably since its inception. "I'll look at it when I'm back," he said. "You'll look at it when I present it to you," she corrected. "Go be terrifying. I'll be here." He came back on the 3rd day at noon. She knew he was back before she saw him. The house changed when he entered it, some atmospheric shift that she'd stopped trying to rationalize and simply accepted as a property of the man, the way certain materials changed the quality of light in a room by virtue of their presence. She was at her desk and she made herself finish the paragraph she was drafting before she went downstairs, because she was a woman with dignity and professional self-possession and not, she reminded herself firmly, someone who ran toward doors. She walked at a measured pace. She was almost convincing. He was in the entrance hall, coat still on, speaking quietly with Rourke, and when he saw her coming down the stairs something happened to his expression that she was entirely unprepared for despite 12 weeks of preparation. It opened. Fully, without the half-second delay of a man remembering to moderate himself. He simply looked at her with the undefended face of someone who had been away and was back and was glad of it in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. Rourke looked between them, developed a sudden pressing need to be elsewhere, and left. Cyprian crossed the hall and stopped in front of her. "It's done," he said. She looked at his face, the tiredness in it, the resolution, the faint remnant of the cut on his jaw now reduced to a thin line that would scar, she thought, in a way that would suit him, because everything about this man was better for having endured. "Delacourt?" "Finished. The organization is dissolved. The assets are seized." He paused. "Everyone who entered this estate, who came within reach of you, it's been addressed. Comprehensively." She held his gaze. "Comprehensively," she said. "Yes." She understood what the word contained and she didn't look away from it, because she had made a decision in a stone corridor when she'd refused a car, and decisions of that magnitude came with the full scope of what they implied. She wasn't a woman who accepted half a world. She had always been, underneath the debt and the diner and the martyrdom of uncomplaining endurance, someone who wanted the whole true shape of things. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No." "Tired?" "Considerably." She reached up then, her turn, finally, unhurried and deliberate, and placed her hand against the side of his face the way he'd placed his against hers in the corridor. His eyes closed for one unguarded second. Just one. The most honest second she'd ever witnessed. "Then come and eat something," she said softly. "And tell me what comes next." He opened his eyes. The expression in them was the one she'd been cataloging for 3 months under the working title of something she didn't have words for yet and had recently, privately, begun to classify more accurately. "You," he said simply. "You come next." She took his hand. She led him toward the warmth of the house they were both, without having announced it, beginning to understand as theirs, and behind them the entrance hall settled into its quiet, and the estate exhaled, and outside the iron gates the city moved on in magnificent indifference to the fact that somewhere inside those old walls, two people had finally, completely, stopped keeping distance. 6 months after Harlow's diner, Elodie Mirth sat at the head of a table that cost more than her first year's salary and told 11 of the most dangerous men in the city that their hospitality division's revenue reporting structure was hemorrhaging money through 4 systemic inefficiencies and that she intended to fix all of them before the end of the quarter. Nobody interrupted her. This was new. Not the competence, she'd always had that, had carried it through double shifts and dissertation defenses and the specific indignity of being underestimated by people who should have known better. What was new was the room's understanding that her words arrived with the full weight of the Voss name behind them, and that the Voss name, in this city, in this world, was not a thing you interrupted. She'd spent some time deciding how she felt about that. She'd arrived, eventually, at something that wasn't discomfort and wasn't uncomplicated pride but lived in the honest territory between them, the acknowledgement that power was a tool, that tools were neutral, and that what mattered was the precision and the intention with which they were applied. Cyprian sat to her left. Not at the head, beside it, which was its own statement, the kind only people fluent in the grammar of his world would fully read. He had his hands folded on the table and the expression of a man entirely at ease, which was the expression of a man who had made a decision he didn't doubt. He had not spoken since he'd introduced her at the meeting's opening with 7 words that had reconfigured every assumption in the room. She speaks for me. Treat her accordingly. 7 words. She'd felt them land in her sternum like something structural. She finished her presentation, fielded 3 questions with the brisk precision of someone who had anticipated them because she'd spent 2 weeks anticipating every question this room might generate, and closed the folder. Around the table, 11 faces performed various arrangements of recalibration. Some of them had known her as the woman who'd arrived in Cyprian's orbit under ambiguous circumstances 3 months prior. Several had watched her run the operations room under siege. One, a gray-haired figure named Castellan, the oldest member of the inner structure, whose approval Rourke had told her was the hardest one in the organization, was looking at her with an expression she was learning to identify as respect from a man who distributed it the way Cyprian distributed almost smiles. Rarely, and with full intention. The Q3 implementation timeline, Castellan said. Aggressive. Yes, she said. Intentionally. The inefficiencies have been compounding for 3 years. Every quarter we don't address them costs us, costs the organization, a recoverable but unnecessary sum. I'd rather move fast and correct course than move cautiously and continue bleeding. A beat. She sounds like you, Castellan said to Cyprian. 20 years ago. Cyprian looked at her with the almost smile, which had evolved considerably over 6 months and now contained genuine warmth underneath its characteristic restraint. She's better, he said. The meeting closed. The room cleared with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that when a Voss gathering ended, you moved. Elodie remained seated, making notes in the margin of her folder, and didn't look up until she felt the room empty around her and the quality of the silence become specific. Cyprian was still there. Of course he was. She looked up and found him watching her the way he'd watched her from booth 7 at Harlow's, with the full, undivided attention of a man who had identified something worth seeing and had no interest in looking elsewhere. 6 months hadn't changed the quality of that gaze. If anything, it had deepened, the way water deepened when you understood you were no longer standing at its edge but immersed in it. Castellan's never said that to anyone, he said. That someone sounds like you? That someone's better. He leaned back. He told me once it was a physical impossibility. She smiled, the full one, not the managed version she developed for professional contexts. I'll try not to let it destabilize his worldview too severely. He'll recover. He stood and came around the table to where she sat and leaned against its edge beside her, close and unhurried, the casual proximity of two people who had long since stopped maintaining performed distance. "How's your mother?" The question landed softly, the way it always did when he asked it, with a gentleness he reserved for things that mattered to her specifically, the particular care of a man who had learned the precise topography of someone and attended to it. "Better. The new specialist is excellent. She called me yesterday, first time she's called just to talk, not about treatment logistics, in almost a year." "Good," he said. Simply. The word full of everything it contained. Vivian Murtha's debt had been formally dissolved 4 months ago, not worked off, not transferred, but eliminated, cancelled with the quiet finality of a man who had decided that the mechanism which had first connected them deserved to be removed entirely, leaving only what had grown in its absence. Elodie had not argued. She had learned, slowly and against the considerable resistance of a personality built on self-sufficiency, that accepting what was freely given was not the same as surrendering what she'd earned. That love, the word lived in her chest now with the settled permanence of something that had found its right location, didn't require ledgers. She stood, and he didn't move back, so they were close in the way they often were now, not performing proximity but simply inhabiting it, the natural consequence of two people who had stopped pretending they preferred distance. "I've been thinking about the legitimate asset structure," she said. "Of course you have. The hospitality division is the most scalable. With the right restructure it could anchor a full commercial portfolio, clean, above board, genuinely profitable without requiring the other verticals to subsidize it." She looked at him directly. "It could stand alone, Cyprian. Eventually. With time and the right financial architecture, it could be the thing that replaces the rest," he said. "I wasn't going to say that. You were going to say it eventually." She held his gaze. "Is it something you've thought about?" He was quiet for a moment, the genuine quiet, the thinking kind, not deflection. "It's something I've thought about more since you arrived than in the 38 years prior." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture that had become theirs the way certain things became the private language of two people, small, consistent, carrying more meaning than its size suggested. "It's a long road. I'm aware. I've run the projections." She paused. 7 years, conservatively. 5, if the hospitality restructure performs the way I believe it will. "You've run the projections." "I run projections the way you stand at windows. It's how I think." He looked at her with the full expression, the one with nothing drawn back, nothing moderated, the face of a man who had spent 38 years being very careful with what he allowed himself and had, in the past 6 months, made a different choice entirely. It still undid her, every time, which she had accepted as a permanent condition and made her peace with. "Then we build it," he said. "Together." The word "together" in his voice was a different kind of document than the one she'd signed at Harlow's Diner 6 months ago. No formal language, no structured terms, no clauses governing the dissolution of obligation. Just the word itself, plainly stated, carrying the full weight of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. She thought about the woman who had stood in that diner with a tray against her chest and fury in her jaw and the accumulated weight of a life that had been using her grace and returning nothing. She thought about the signatures and the silence and the car she hadn't taken and the stone corridor and the midnight study and 11 men around a table who hadn't interrupted her. She thought about what it meant to have walked through the hardest version of your own life and arrived, on the other side, at something that looked like this. She took his hand, both of hers around his one, the way she'd taken it in the entrance hall the day he'd come home, and she looked at the man who had watched her from a distance for 9 months and then simply decided that watching was no longer enough, and she understood, with the full analytical clarity of a mind that had never once shied from the true shape of things, that she was exactly where she had always been capable of being. Not a waitress. Not a debtor. Not a woman being rescued from the edges of her own story. The queen of it. "Together," she said. Outside, the city moved in its magnificent indifference. Inside, In a room full of the furniture of power, two people held the same word between them like a foundation and began, quietly and without ceremony, to build. And just like that, the debt is gone. The distance is closed. The choice has been made by a woman who never once stopped choosing herself, even when she was choosing him. But empires don't stay quiet. Queens don't get crowns without a fight. And Cyprian and Elodie's world is only beginning to show you what it's truly made of. If this story found something in you, if you felt the stillness of Booth 7, the weight of a midnight study, the specific electricity of two people with no business wanting each other who did it anyway and meant every second of it, then you already know what comes next. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that slow burns deserve to be found. That dark, intelligent romance with a woman who spots a financial leak and holds down a fortress under siege is exactly the kind of story that should be in everyone's feed. Subscribe to the channel. Because Harlow's Diner is just one door, and there is an entire world of them, each one with a man who is too much, a woman who is more than enough, and a tension so thick you'll feel it in your chest at 2 a.m. And leave a comment. I need to know, were you hers from the moment she refused the car? Or did Cyprian have you from don't speak to her? Tell me which line broke you. I'll be reading every single one. The next story is already waiting. Don't make it wait long.